on behalf of all children in our schools. At this event, there will be a PowerPoint presentation made by Michael Elliott from the Oregon Department of Education, explaining the funding process and the measures that put our schools in the state that they are today. It will be followed by questions and answers from Mr. Elliott, Senator Mark Hass, and Representative Tobias. If a question is asked that can only be answered by the DOT school district, one of our volunteers will write your question down and will be answered on the district website. When it comes to this event, being a mother of two who are in the public schools, people have asked me, why is this important? Why do we need to understand this? If we don't understand the basics of funding of this complex issue, how will we ever know the questions to ask and who to ask it to? How are we ever going to take the proper steps to get out from under this? This is about our children, about theirs and our future. This isn't about pointing fingers at representatives and districts and demanding them to fix it. We have a hand, a say, from neighbors to business owners, on what happens to our greatest investment, these children. It starts with educating ourselves, becoming involved, and communicating with one another. It takes listening to possible solutions, and not just shaking your head no, but to consider the steps that need to happen to get us there. I, for one, am willing to do anything, toss out any idea, if it means getting back our programs, lowering class sizes, bringing back our school days, and making education for all children a positive experience. Public schooling isn't a lost cause, but we all, community, district, and state, need to be the change that we want to see in our schools. Thank you.
Good evening. Everyone hear me okay? Yes. How many of you are looking at state school fund for the first time? That is awesome to see. Thank you all for coming. I cannot overstate the importance of the state school fund. When you look at your income tax bill, 40 cents out of every dollar you pay in state income taxes goes to fund education in Oregon. 40 cents. It is probably the biggest budget item that Senator Hass and Representative Reed have to deal with when they're in the Capitol. Hi, welcome to your state school fund. My name is Michael Elliott. I'm with the Oregon Department of Education. I do have a few topics. This is about state school funds, so there will be a couple classes. The first class is history. We'll be talking about the history of school funding and looking at some major measures that have changed it. Then we'll talk about the goals of the school funding formula. We'll look at current revenue. Yes, that is the math class. There's good news, there's no test. And then we'll be looking at the actual components of the state school fund and how it works together. So school funding can really be broken down into two periods. The first period is before ballot measure 5, and the second period is after ballot measure 5. School funding before ballot measure 5 looked generally like this. 60% of the revenue came from local property taxes. 30% of the revenue came from state income taxes, and 10% from the federal government. That had some benefits and it had some detractions as well. Some of the benefits, property taxes in general are a stable source of revenue. Property values do not fluctuate as much as state incomes. The detractors are, as we all know in real estate, it's location, location, location. Some districts had really good property tax values, some districts did not, and so there was some inequity across the state. Ballot Measure 5 was passed in 1990 and did several things, but I'm only focused here on what it did for school funding. The first thing it did was it capped the tax rate. This was in response. Oregon citizens had a concern that local property taxes and the rates were increasing at unsustainable levels. And so they wanted to cap the rate. So they capped the rate to $5 for every 1,000 of assessed value. And then they said to the state, guess what? You get to make up the difference. So the state then had to fund any losses to the local district. So if a district lost revenue because of this cap, the state had to cover it. Oregon citizens weren't done. They felt that Measure 5 was not complete and there were some concerns with it, maybe some loopholes. So they passed Measures 47 and 50 in 1996 and 97 respectively. What these measures did was first, they cut the assessed property values. So now property values were cut to 1995 values minus 10%. So they not only capped the rate, they cut the property value. They said, no, we really want to slow this growth of taxes. The second thing they did was they capped growth to a yearly growth of 3% per year. So they cut the rate, they capped the property values, and they capped the growth rate going into the future. So graphically, So school funding post-Measure 47, what happened? Well, school funding basically switched. Local revenue went from 60% of total revenue to 30%. State income tax revenue went to 60%, and federal revenue stayed the same, about 10%. What are some consequences of this? Well, volatility was introduced into the school funding formula. As I said, tax revenue from property taxes is generally stable. I realize this recession, we have seen a drop in property values. I'm not saying it's permanently stable, it's just generally stable. Whereas boom and bust cycle of income taxes is much more frequent. We saw the dot-com era, the dot-com bust, the housing bubble, the housing bust. We're living through that right now. All of that, affects income taxes far more than it affects property values. So there was a volatility in the school funding. The state became the primary source of school funding, and this had several implications because the state cares about equity and how it defined equity and made sure that each district was receiving equal amounts on a weighted basis, and I'll explain that a little bit more. And then also, again, because the state was the funder and equalized funding across the districts, the state is concerned. They want to make sure that a student in Malheur County has the same educational funding as, say, a student in Beaverton or Washington County. Graphically, here's what happened. I want you to look at local funding, and you see that local funding drops during the 1990s. Direct result of Measure 5, 47, and 50. And then you see that slow, steady growth up. That's that 3% per year. We flattened out a little bit because this recession has hit property values, so property values are actually dropping down. Their assessed values are going down a little bit. State funding, that red one, you see it is much more volatile. It does go up. That's a result of Measure 5 saying the state has to make up the difference. You see a general increase in the 90s when we had that nice dot-com thing going on and technology was going. And then you see the boom-bust cycle of the early 2000s. It goes up a bit, and now you see the results of the Great Recession. You see a drop, and you see it flattening out. And you see total funding really reflecting state funding. Because remember, 60% of funding for the statewide education system comes from the income tax revenue. That last graph did not include any federal stimulus dollars. These were part of the American Reinvestment and Recovery Act. As you can see here, those dollars came into public education, mainly in 2009-10, 2010-11. The net result is they basically kept funding flat. So even with federal dollars, we have not seen a significant increase in education funding over the last 4 or 5 years. So that's your history lesson. That was pretty easy, right? So let's talk about the goals of the state school fund. Again, the goal, because the state is one of the main funders, this is paramount goal, is equalized funding across all districts. Second goal, there's education service districts. For those of you who don't know, education service districts provide some IT support, some special education support, and some back office support to the smaller districts out there. We have a lot of tiny districts in Eastern Oregon, and so the education service district will provide like a business officer, will provide some special education services, that sort of thing. And the state school fund wants to make sure that it equalizes funding between those two. The last goal is defining this equity. What does equity mean? In Oregon, equity is based according to student and school characteristics. Equity is based on weights. It is not based on students. Oregon does not fund on a per student level. Oregon funds on a per weight level. One student can have more weights. One student can have more than one weight. One student can have less than one weight. And I'll explain all of that later. So distribution principles, this is important because I want you to understand how the state tries to reach those goals. First, equalized district funding. 30% of funding still comes from local revenue. The state has to account for that local revenue. The local revenue stays with the district. Any taxes you pay through your property values, through your property taxes, that go to Beaverton School District stay with Beaverton School District. It's kind of like Vegas. What happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. What you raise in Beaverton stays in Beaverton. It does not come to the state. The state doesn't collect it. The state does not distribute it. I just asked Beaverton to report it because if Beaverton is getting a lot of local revenue, I need to equalize and say, well, you don't get as much state revenue. I have to give more state revenue to those districts that do not have a tax base that you do. So I just account for it. To equalize district and ESD funding, statutes set the percentages. 95.5% of all money flowing through the formula goes to districts. ESDs get 4.5%. District equity. I've talked about that we fund on a weighted basis. Well, districts with more weights, like Beaverton, will get more funding, more absolute dollars, than say districts like Malheur County that have less weights. And a final distribution principle really affects all Oregon governments, and that is local control. Oregonians, we love our local control. We want to have those in charge be responsible to those they're governing. So your local school board gets to make a lot of decisions about how that budget works. They get the money from the state, from local access. The state, through the state school fund, does not really tell them how to spend the money. They have requirements they have to meet. They have a budget they have to put together. They decide how they're going to fund those requirements and fund that budget. And that's where you come in. You elect your school board officials. You get an opportunity to tell the school board officials what programs you want to see, what programs you don't. Obviously, resources are limited, so there has to be some give and take there. The legislature may and has on occasion said, no, we are going to assign money to school districts for very specific purposes. They can do that. So that would be outside of local control, but those amounts of money are far smaller than what's going through the formula. So I've talked about what the formula is. I also want you to realize what the formula is not. There is some misconceptions about the formula. These are all myths. They're not what the formula does. It does not reimburse costs. The state does not go around and say, how much does it cost to educate students in Oregon? How much money does it take? And then give that money. The state says, what money do we have for education? And can we make sure we distribute it equally? There's no entitlement. This is not an entitlement program. A student can't say, hey, I'm not getting the funding I'm entitled to, and then sue the state based on that. Again, this distributes the money available. It does not assure funding stability or adequacy. If you remember that graph, we saw ups, we saw downs as a result of where the funding source is. It does not measure student outcomes. Now, there are measures of student outcomes. There is the report card. There is the new achievement compacts. But those are not, the state school fund doesn't really relate to those. It just gives the money to the districts to meet those goals. And it also does not, the state school fund in and of itself is not an accountability system. That goes back to local control. That's up to the school board being responsive to its community and its citizens to make sure it is providing the best education it can. So we've done history, now we get into math class. Again, good news, there's no quiz, and I do all the math for you. It's great. This, if you take nothing else from my presentation, I want you to remember this concept. Statewide equity is total revenue minus carve-outs divided by statewide total weights. The rest of the presentation explains this formula. This is the school forming formula distilled to its essence. There's a lot of other stuff that goes on, but this is basically it. How do we get statewide equity? Through this formula, we take the total revenue, we take out carve-outs for specific programs, we divide by the total number of weights in the state. And that's what you get per weight. That's what Beaverton will then get. When it adds up its weights, it multiplies by that number, and that's what Beaverton gets. So let's go through this. Total revenue, very straightforward. State revenue plus local revenue. Again, local revenue stays with the district where it's collected. We actually have some districts that have very small student populations and very high local revenues, such that receive no additional state dollars. They actually receive more than the funding formula says they could. It stays with their district. I do not take it back and redistribute it. They just get left. Current state and local revenue, you see that that's holding to that 30-60. State local revenue is about 35%. State revenue is about 65%. Right now, for the 2011-13 biennium, total revenue, state and local, is estimated at $8.852 billion. That's about $4.4 billion per year funding the K-12 system. So those are the numbers we're talking about. $4 billion a year in total revenue. Where does the revenue come from? The state provided $5.713 billion this biennium. Most of that comes from the general fund, made up of income tax revenue. Some comes from lottery funds, some comes from other funds. Lottery funds accounted for a slightly higher percentage this biennium because this legislature provided additional money to districts so long as districts met specific requirements. That's where they said, we don't want local control here. We're giving this school year sub-account money. We want to make sure that these requirements are met, and all the districts met them. They're very general requirements. So it was a way to get more money to the districts. Local revenue, even greater reliance on property taxes, 94.5%. The Common School Fund is also a significant portion. The Common School Fund was, I've got to go back to history now, was established at statehood, and it provided for a parcel of land in every township to be designated and given over to state education. That has morphed over the 150 years of our state, and now it's the Department of State Lands manages land and investments for the Common School Fund. The Common School Fund then gives about 3.2% to the state every year in terms of revenue. Again, local revenue is for the biennium, about $3.1 billion. That's about $1.55 billion a year, most of that in property tax. Federal forest fees, I just want to mention them briefly. They are money that the federal government is providing to counties in Oregon that have been hindered, or their economic development has been hindered because of restrictions on logging and use of the federal forest. That money only is good through 2012-13. We do not know if the federal government will continue that through in the future. So we talked about total revenue, right? Statewide equity equals total revenue. Now we're going to talk about the carve-outs and weights. I call them carve-outs. Carve-outs really are money set aside for specific purposes of this. This is where the legislature says, in the state school fund, set aside this money for these programs. And I'll address the ones that are really relevant to Beaverton. Weights, these are the variables used to determine how much money each school district gets. The weights are the basis of equity. Specific programs are one version of carve-outs. They only account for about $11 million a year, or $22 million biennium. Remember, we're at $4.4 billion a year. $11 million a year is not that much. So these are not a significant impact, but they are an impact, and I want you to be aware of them. Programs include state tag services. This provides for a tag specialist to help districts with their tag plans. The Oregon School for the Deaf comes out of this money. Also, long-term care and treatment facilities come out of this money, as well as a couple others. Sub-grants are grants given to districts, but for specific purposes, and there's 4 of them. The small high school grant is $2.5 million a year. I'm sorry, Beaverton does not qualify. We're not that small. The high cost disability grant, this is to help with some special education costs, and Beaverton does qualify for this. The facility grant, if you construct a new classroom space, you get some additional money to help with furnishings. Briefly discuss that. And then finally, the transportation grant. This is the biggest sub-grant, and I want to spend a little time on that in a second. So again, the ones that matter to Beaverton School District, the high cost disability grant. So we have special education students in our system, but unfortunately we have some severely disabled students that need a lot of extra resources. If each school district has a student that costs more than $30,000 a year in a given year in special education needs, then the state will reimburse them above that $30,000 floor. So if they have $50,000 in costs, the state will reimburse that $20,000 in costs. Now, this grant, like the facility grant, is prorated, and right now it's paying about 53%. Because the need is so high, we have that many special education students in the system, that we're paying about 53 cents on the dollar. So out of that $20,000 that the state is eligible to be reimbursed, the state's probably giving you about $10,600, something like that. The facility grant, when bonding laws were changed in the early to mid-90s, the state school or school construction bonds could not pay for desks and chairs and seats and auditoriums and that sort of thing. And so this grant was established by the legislature to help pay for those costs. And it says it pays up to 8% of construction costs right now. Again, because the eligible costs exceed the amount of revenue, we're paying about 5 to 5.5% of eligible costs. So if you have a construction program that came in at $10 million, then the state would pay about $500,000 to help with furnishing that new facility. The transportation grant, again, this is the biggest grant. Right now, it is about $183 million a year. So even at $4.4 billion, that's a significant chunk of money. It reimburses eligible transportation costs. Well, that's nice. What are those? Those are taking students to and from school, education-related field trips, maintaining your buses, maintaining your fleet, maintaining the currency of it, that sort of thing. There are 3 rates that you get reimbursed at, 70, 80, and 90%. Those are set by your total transportation cost divided by your ADMR. ADMR is average daily membership resident. It is how we count students for funding purposes. I'll get to that in just a second. And for Beaverton